Hi, my name's Bob Shepherd. I'm the author of The Infidel. It's a fiction story set in Afghanistan in the present day, and it's a take on Rudyard Kipling's short story of the man who would be king. What instigated that, quite frankly, is I've been a security advisor working in Afghanistan since early 2004, and since last year, which is almost 6 years in Afghanistan, I've seen the place for what it is. I've been able to travel around unilaterally, driving through the provinces of Afghanistan. But year on year, that's been limited due to the extreme security situation there. I've had the pleasure of taking journalists on the ground, both unilaterally and with military embeds. And although the journalists have their story to tell, I've been able to see things with open eyes, not taking one side or the other. And it's been great because if the journalists, for example, have a particular story to tell, it may be a 3-minute piece on TV, but it may take up to 3 weeks to get that story. And because of that, I've been able to stand back and listen to people who may not be willing to talk on camera, but are certainly willing to talk to somebody on the ground, and make my own assumptions of what's really going on. And in recent years, it hasn't been what you read in the papers or you see on TV. It's been completely different from that. And I appreciate that, we supposedly live in a democracy, but there are an awful lot of things in places like Afghanistan where the story isn't being told the way that the scene is on the ground. I've been in Afghanistan for 6 years. Mainly full on, actually. 50% of the time I was a security advisor to journalists. The other 50% of the time doing close protection, which is basically a security team for high profile diplomats, and also teaching hostile environment training to diplomats and other international people inside Afghanistan. It's probably the most wonderful country I've ever been to in my life. And I'm 55 years old now, and I've been pretty much all over the world. The country's breathtaking. The people themselves are like no other. They're extremely photogenic, whether it's males, females, young and old alike. You don't see many of the females because that's not the traditional way. Unfortunately, in that part of the world, most of them are locked away, but you do get occasional glimpses. Afghanistan, if you're travelling by road, the scenery changes about every 20 minutes. It's absolutely glorious. If you're in a helicopter, however, the scenery changes about every 20 seconds. The colours change, the shapes of the countryside change, and it's just an amazing, amazing place. The only sad situation is it's very insecure. The early days there in 2004, I was able unilaterally to drive pretty much all over Afghanistan. And as an example, I took a fantastic drive with a small news team from Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, all the way south through several provinces down to Helmand, where the British troops are fighting at the moment. And although the Taliban were quite free down there in those days, they were willing to talk to you. And that was an eye-opener too, because the American forces were there in extremely small numbers, and it was mainly their special forces. And the Taliban that I spoke with basically said that they didn't want any outsiders there. They'd had the British up to 200 years previous, they had the Russians, and now they've got what they call the Americans, which is basically all the NATO forces lumped together, and they're all referred to as Americans. And they just don't like outsiders. They're an amazing race of people in that they're total survivors. The last 30 years they've had war since the Russians, and they were able to push the Russians out of Afghanistan and send them packing back to Russia. They then had their own civil war, which in the last 30 years was probably the worst scenario in recent events in Afghanistan, where different factions were absolutely brutal towards each other. They've basically been fighting a 30-year civil war, which the United States and the people working with the United States, and that's the British included, came in and took one side of that civil war. And today, as I speak in 2010, that civil war is still ongoing, only the Western world call it an insurgency. Whether we stay or whether we leave, the civil war will be basically full-blown. And sadly for the Afghans, they'll be back to where they were during the phase after the Russians left. And that would be catastrophic for the people of Afghanistan. But I don't see another way out of it, unfortunately. In 2007, I went with a small news team. Actually, it was the first Western TV news network to go to a place, a very remote province in the northeast of Afghanistan called Nuristan. And up there at the time, the American forces were having a very difficult time just basically establishing themselves in the deep valleys of Nuristan. We went up there and we spent just over a week. And in that time, we went to a place called Kamdesh, and it was a small operating base. And I have never been in a situation with military people so scary in my life. We got off the helicopter, and the faces of the American soldiers basically told the scenario of what was going on. I've seen American soldiers all over Afghanistan. They're no different from any other soldier. They have their off time, they can chill, etc., etc. But these people were really wired. Their eyes were out on stalks, and the poor guys never got a minute to themselves where they could relax. And it was a scary location. It was a tiny location, a forward operating base, at the bottom of a very deep set valley next to a fast flowing river. And I would not want to be there, even in my 23 years in the military, for 5 minutes. The time I got off the helicopter to the time I got on, I just wasn't happy. The sad thing about this location is that just before last Christmas, 2009, 2 years later, the place was taken out by the opposition. I think something like 8 or 9 American soldiers were killed and several were wounded. The place eventually got overrun. American helicopters came in and took out the dead and wounded, and the soldiers were forced to leave a lot of their kit and equipment there for the Taliban to take. So a dreadful situation that in my view was always going to happen. When I got back from there, it reminded me of the time of watching a 1970s film that was originally from a Rudyard Kipling short story called The Man Who Would Be King. It's a fabulous film with Sean Connery and Michael Caine, set in India, Afghanistan, during the Victorian times. And actually here in 2007 at the time when I was in Nuristan, nothing had changed since the Victorian times. It was still Western troops in defensive positions being attacked basically by the local population who didn't want them there in the first place. And that really set my mind to writing a modern day version of Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King and setting it in Nuristan. The Infidel, I thoroughly enjoyed writing the book, and I hope everybody thoroughly enjoys reading it. As I say, it was a modern day plot inspired by Rudyard Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King. Rudyard Kipling, when he wrote the short story, he was a Mason, and he put a lot of Masonic references into the short story. I'm not a Mason, but having read the short story and seen the film, I thought it would be a good idea to do the same. So for people that read the book and have perhaps an interest in Masonic references, they may want to try and pick out where they are and how many there are within the story. Basically, the plot of the book, it's 2 ex-SAS soldiers that work in the security industry, the commercial security industry, and they're doing a task in Afghanistan on behalf of the British government. And they get themselves in, for want of a better word, a bit of a mess. And basically their only way out is the Afghan way out, which is to go to this remote province, Nuristan, and seek the help of the local elders who can basically give them their freedom. It's an adventure story, and the two guys involved, John and Dusty, undertake quite an adventure. I'd like to think that when people have read the book, I'm sure, like going out and buying a pair of shoes, people will see it in different ways and make different assumptions. But the aim basically is to show people my interpretation, having been on the ground for 6 years and being completely impartial, what the West has yet again got mixed up in Afghanistan, and how it's very easy, even with the best of intentions, to get into trouble in Afghanistan and seek a way out. And I think it's the book, in my view, having written it, is everything about Afghanistan and about Afghan values and the skullduggery that goes on in order for these poor people just simply to survive.